Welcome. It's a very quiet venue here. It's quite interesting. I could actually whisper and you could all still hear me. Has everyone managed to grab one of these? So they're up the back, if you want to grab one quickly, because we will use this briefly during the talk tonight, just to make sure you've all got a copy. It's a really, really handy, it's one of the best what to plant when guides that I've seen. I started gardening when I was forced to do weeding when I was about under 10, probably about 6 or 7. Yeah, but we were actually allowed to make kind of, turn the empty veggie beds into a mud pit, which was great because then we had fun and we were unknowingly actually turning the soil over and preparing for the next season's crops. Or maybe we did know it, but it was good fun. So I was lucky to be growing up with a veggie garden, 1/4 of an acre at Seaview Downs. And then when I started getting into permaculture and sustainability in late teens, early 20s, I started actually doing it for myself, and I've just kind of gone on from there. Did my first course in Borough in 1994, and then just thought, okay, that's it. I'm going to follow this as a career. And it's led me to work in, basically practice all over Australia, work in Timor and Indonesia, and then in Darwin for about 6 or 7 years, and then UK and Europe for a couple of years. And it's great to be back in Adelaide. I always love it here, and I've always kept strong connections, so it's really nice to be back now and working with Permaculture SA. And tonight, hopefully, we're just going to do a really interactive Q&A and talk about what our gardens are going to look like now and then through autumn and winter. You can throw in different questions about any other time of year you want as well, that's fine. But we'll kind of mainly focus on what's happening now and what we want to do in our garden and in our space around the house. Can be large garden, small garden, it doesn't matter. I like a really interactive workshop, so please ask questions as we're going along. We've got a bit of a slideshow, but that'll just be to prompt questions and discussions more than getting you to kind of look through 150 slides. So feel free to jump in, not just to ask, but also to give your own examples, because there's a lot of knowledge in the room, and there's connections that we don't know about that hopefully we can also get people to get to know each other a bit more tonight as well. There are lots of community gardens around Adelaide. Adelaide's fantastic for community gardens, and that's a really good place to learn from people who've been doing it for a long time. I'm a member of the Goody Patch near Goodwood, which is a fantastic little garden, and I find community gardens are just great for as much for the community as anything else. But you always get those people who are just super keen at propagating and planting and just like sharing their knowledge and their plants, and it just keeps on multiplying from there. So I definitely recommend, if you're keen to learn more, then being a member of a community garden is a great way to get involved. So permaculture is about sustainable communities, sustainable living, and how we design our land and our lifestyles around how much time we've got as well. So it's about the human element, but it's also about the physical element and understanding what we see around us and making the most of it and making it as productive as we can, and doing it in a way which improves it over time. So I've got listed here for the first one, which is know your garden. So where is it sunny or shady? And it's so important in the winter. You can have places, because the sun moves a lot to the north in the winter, where it's sunny in summer might be shady in winter. Where I moved to Selleck's Beach when we first came back to Adelaide, they had their garden bed there, which we started on, was completely sunny in summer and completely shaded in winter, because it was right against a north fence, and it was completely in the wrong spot. So So we changed that and built garden beds where it was semi-shaded in summer and completely sunny in the winter, because that gives a lot better production. Next one is, where might you get frost? So I was really surprised last year we actually got some frost in Goodwood. So some of us are in areas where there might be some of us are in areas where it might not be, but it's good to observe, keep on observing and seeing what's going on. Where does the rain go and collect? There might be areas in your garden which are more waterlogged. That's where you plant your mint. And there might be areas which are dry out really quickly and which are more difficult. So a lot of you have been talking about your raised garden beds, so that moderates that issue very well, and it means that you're more able to be much more efficient with your water use, but also not worry so much about where it might be drier and where it might be boggier. But you might still get that issue, and especially if you're planting in the ground, then that can be a big one, especially for clay soils. Do the cold winds blow through, and are there sheltered spaces? So in the winter, that can have a big impact on your plant. So when you get the winter winds coming through, you know that well in Normanville, I knew that at Selix. So that can have, the plants just go, no, I'm just going to sit here and hibernate.
You'll sit there, they'll just blow away.
Yeah. Well, at least we had a back fence to block some of the wind, thankfully. Are there warm pockets? So there might be little sheltered areas which are a great microclimate. And then the last one I had there is, what winter weeds are likely to grow? So all of this is about your observation of what's going on in your yard and just understanding the different microclimates and the different areas that might be better and might be worse. And all of that knowledge, you'll be surprised, it accumulates over time, and you just intrinsically understand. And that photo's of my backyard, which is nice. That was in winter. And around the back veranda is a nice kind of protected shelter area for all our herbs. And then around the back and sides are fruit trees. Anyway, we'll keep going. So we are going to look at what to plant and when, but before we do that, we need to look at how we're going to prepare our beds. So a lot of people make the mistake, well, it's not a mistake, but it slows things down. A lot of people plant the seedlings or the seeds and then put the fertilizer on afterwards, which can kind of seem like it's, that's, quick, we've got to go and get the seeds and put them in. But it's actually a lot better for your plants if you prepare the beds first, put some good compost on, some rotted cow manure if you can find some. If anyone's driving to Victor, there's a great cow manure place just near the Pages Flat turnoff. And there's a big sign there, cow manure. Near opposite, what's the shop there? On the right-hand side,
It's an exhaust and car.
And you go down the Wollonga Hill towards Victor, but it's on the left-hand side just after Pages Flat, and they sell cow manure, organic cow manure in big bags, which is good to get. Anyway, it's really important to do that first, and then get some good organic fertilizer, and then mix it in, and then water it, and let it settle. And then let your garden sit, and then the soil, kind of all the microbes and the organisms and the worms can move it around, can basically prepare it for your plants to be able to use it. And if you're able to do that for a week or two first, then that makes a big difference to the seeds and the seedlings that you put in. And if you're adding stuff and dressing afterwards, then it's just a bit of it's not a bad thing, but it's just everything accelerates better if the ground's well prepared beforehand.
On the wicking beds and the raised beds that we've got, do you recommend introducing worms, so buying them externally and introducing them? Because the way my wicking beds are, it's in a plastic tub. So obviously they're
How big?
not going to get in there, so
Yeah.
100 off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's the, ones from container tubs and half.
Ah, yeah, great. I've got a photo later showing how you can do worm tunnels in your garden bed.
Yeah, okay.
So I was talking to a woman a few weeks ago who had a great example of doing exactly that in her wicking beds.
Oh, cool.
And then you have to introduce them, but as long as you feed them and keep the moisture content good for them, then certainly that's a great way to cycle nutrients.
Okay.
And then the worms will kind of help to do that work for you.
So do you have a suggestion of like ratio of compost to soil?
Yeah, good question. So if you were to put compost on, you would either do a layer, so you could do the whole bed and do 3 to 5 centimetres thick of compost is a good amount I would do that with my own prepared compost. If you get store-bought compost, you could do 2 to 3 centimetres. If you're able to get it from places like SA Composters, they do deliveries as well, or you can get it from them in more bulk amounts. And the SA Composters are great. They're in Lonsdale, and you can just go and take your garbage bins and they'll work out a price and fill it up for you. So there's no plastic, and just fill it up, take it home.
They do that at Marion as well, Marion Road, they've got Jeffrey's.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Yep.
we just take buckets and
Yeah.
spray as well.
And that's a good quality compost too.
It is very good.
So it's also good to get a good organic fertiliser to mix in with that. So then I've also included there seeds or seedlings, and then fruit tree maintenance and fertilising are things to think about with preparing, but we'll be talking about that as we go through. So I will keep going. So that was our 2 garden beds last winter with a mixture of kale, lettuce, parsley, bok choy, broccoli, broad beans, spinach and snow peas, and some Brussels sprouts that we grew that we planted too late. And we got right to the end of the season, we're going, come on, and they were about that big. So we've planted them already this year. And we planted it, and then the last week has been 30 degrees, so the poor Brussels sprouts have been like, oh dear. But they have survived, and hopefully we've planted them early enough to get them going so that we can actually get some decent Brussels sprouts this year. That would be nice. So you've all got one of these, which has been done by the fabulous Nat Wiseman, who runs with Jess, Village Greens at, not this Jess, at Aldinga. And so that's an amazing market garden. And so this has been basically put together by someone who really is like what to plant and when for maximum production, and knowing the extent of the cycles that you can actually use. And it's specifically for Adelaide. And a really good one to note is that on this side it's got number of sowings and frequency. So that's often one that people, when you're planning your rotations, to know how long things take to either reach the maturity, say for like a bok choy or a lettuce or a broccoli, and then so how many cycles you can get within a growing period. And that really helps to understand to maximise your amounts. Now the growing times can change, like your planting times, and that's, we were talking just before about how the seasons will change each year, and understanding this is one thing, but sometimes the weather can just throw things completely out. So over time as a gardener you'll become a bit more intuitive to what's actually going on weather-wise, and also seeing what the plants are doing and knowing how long they might take, and then knowing when it's a lost cause and you're like, I'm on tomatoes, like I'm going to try and get a few more tomatoes out of you. But really, if you get that extra month of trying to grow the tomatoes and you get 2 tomatoes, you've basically wasted a month of growing of your next crop. that you need to put in, and then you kind of plant them too late and they just don't actually grow through the winter because you've been too late. So it's just kind of understanding that there'll always be something you have to sacrifice to get the next crop in, but you understand that, you know, that beyond a certain time frame, your zucchinis aren't going to give you any more. Your cucumbers are going to droop down, and you know, you might get one or two tiny ones, but it's just not worth it. It's worth kind of rotating your garden bed, getting ready for the next cycles. So I've got a list there which kind of covers the main things on here, which is just simply all your brassicas. So your cauliflower, your Brussels sprouts. So now is unfortunately right at the end of your Brussels sprout planting. But it's still pretty warm, so if you get in really quick with seedlings, not seeds, if you try and do your brassica seeds now, you'll probably be a bit late. So your broccolis, your cabbages, all of those are really good to plant now, or your kales. Peas and beans are perfect time to plant now, or snow peas. Coming into the right time for your bush peas. Broad beans, great to plant basically from now all through winter, depending on when you want to plant it. They're a really good one that are more flexible depending on when your other crops finish. Sometimes you've got a smaller window for some plants, but sometimes you've got a bigger window depending on the type of vegetable. So I really love the broad beans because they've got a big window of when you can plant them, and they're always giving you something. Whether you eat them fresh, whether you cook them, whether you know, when the pods are really small, you can cook the whole lot as well. So all your leafy greens, all your kales, even your lettuce, if you've got a shady spot or a sheltered spot, gets a nice amount of sun, grow your lettuce all through winter's fine. And so your rockets, your silver beets, your chards, all of those. I noticed on here Nat reckons that it's getting to the end of planting for your silver beets, but I reckon if you get good strong seedlings you'll still be able to get them through. But your spinaches and that's still great, and all your kales. Root veggies, if you want to do your carrots, get them in now, because carrots you have to do from seed. But then you've got a few months. So going into spring, and then basically carrots are all year round apart from just the cold winter months. Beetroot, pretty much all year round if you're in a, you know, not in the hills where it gets really frosty. And yeah, it's good to, so it's this month into the next month and a half is a really good planting time, as long as you kind of get in earlier than later. And if you really do need to plant it, then ignore what I said first about preparing your beds first. Well, try and prepare it and then give it a really good watering and then plant it the next day. And then just try and get hold of some worm juice or something like that to really up the amount of microorganisms in your soil, because that'll help to get things moving and breaking down really quickly. So, questions?
As I say, Oliver's, they've got a product called Mink and Poo.
Okay.
And it's certified organic. It's chicken and it's brilliant.
Okay.
Really, really good.
Yep. It's a good recommendation. So, out of this and out of like planting questions, has anyone got any specific questions about things?
I was just going to ask, how big an area is that? Is your veggie garden there?
So those are two.
How many people is that kind of running for? Out of curiosity?
For mainly two, but we do share around a lot. So it's about 1 metre by 2 metres for each bed. So we do have other beds more than that to do things like planting our garlic and kind of like bigger winter crops, leeks, and so some things you kind of plant in blocks. So these are kind of mixed together and that can work quite well. So garlic hates being mixed. I tried it, and I was like, garlic's, you know, it's a really good one for your pest control. I thought, I'll plant it around my broccoli, and that'll help to the pest control for the broccoli. It might have worked because I didn't get many pests, but I didn't get any garlic. They just got crowded out by the broccoli and that was it. I kind of found like these tiny little piddly things at the end of October. But garlic's a really good one to plant from April into May. And I recommend planting it in a block. They actually like a lot of feed. So they hate competition. But when you're thinking about companion planting, just because you've got it in a block and then you've got other things next to it, that's still companion planting. You don't always have to mix like this. It's good to know what likes mixing and what doesn't like mixing so much. So leek's a really good one to plant now. Again, they don't like mixing because leeks you have to kind of, as you grow them, you need to mound the soil up around the stems because that makes that beautiful white part. If you don't mound the soil up as they grow, then they stay green and then you just get this little white bit at the bottom. So if you're kind of intercropping with other plants, then where are you going to grab your soil from? And you're kind of making life hard for the other plants.
I've got a whole lot of kale plants left over from last winter. It's kind of sad. They're still producing little kale leaves. I just leave them there and they're going to just kind of blossom this winter? Or do I have to get new ones?
Is that the Tuscan or the Nero, Cabro Nero? So the dark green leaf?
No, it's slightly greyish.
Yeah, that's it. Yep, so it's kind of green, dark greeny grey.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that one can go for over a year before it flowers. But it gets to a stage where it kind of doesn't have the momentum to produce much more. Are they being hit by whitefly much at the moment?
Yes.
Yeah, because that happens at the end of summer and that really slows them down. So basically ours stopped. I don't know if you can see. So under our fruit trees, we've got a whole lot of kale and rocket and silver beet and borage and stuff just growing wild. They all just stopped growing at a certain point, and the whitefly was part of it. So we eventually just thought, I'm just sick of scrubbing the kale to get the whitefly off to eat it. And it was getting to a point where, okay, I'll do something. So I just hit it with a neem oil and soap spray, a bit of chili and garlic, and did that twice, and that's knocked back the whitefly enough for the kale to have a last oomph. So I'd do that. I'd try and reduce the whitefly numbers, give them a good feed, see if you can get something good out of it, but eventually it will seed, and then you'll have to let them go. But if they don't spring back after that, I'd replace them with new ones.
Thanks. Thank you.
So, just see how we're going time-wise. Okay, not too bad. Any other questions about what to plant and when for specific plants? Nope. Well, that's good. But make sure you keep, I had to pull that one off the toilet wall because we have it there. So we're going, ooh, what am I going to plant? That's a good spot to have it. Or when above the kitchen sink as you're doing the dishes is another good place to ponder what you're going to plant. So I've got a few little points here. This was actually a photo taken at Village Greens, and there was the deep winter gathering. So it's not that everyone's just turned their back on the photographer. They were actually listening to Nat talk. And there's a selection of plants that are really good to grow. They've got growing in winter, from your kales, your chards. They've got the young, probably broccoli growing in there, rows of carrots, and then all the parsley behind that. So if you're into your propagating of plants, you can have some success now, but going into late winter and spring is actually a better time for when you're kind of taking cuttings or taking rootstock, because now they're coming into their dormant period. So if you're wanting to get new growth, which is what happens when you're trying to propagate something, then it's better to wait until the end of winter and early spring, because then they'll just have that oomph to get going. Whereas if you're wanting to repot or move something, then coming into winter and when the plant's most dormant is actually the best time to do it, because then the roots are the least disturbed. So there's a distinct difference there of, like, if you have to actually move a tree or a herb or a plant or repot something, then winter's actually a good time to do it. But your propagation, you want that energy to be going through the plant, and in the winter, or coming into winter, it's kind of, the energy's going down, and a lot of plants will kind of pretty much, yeah, they just stop growing and they won't really do too much. And I also had a point there, some things you can plant only from seed, or it's best to, like carrots and things like broad beans. But a lot of things you can plant from seedling, or most things. So if you feel like you're a bit late in your growing cycles and you don't have the, like, you know, you can actually go, well, I'm not going to plant from seed this time, because that takes an extra 3 weeks to get it to the time where you buy your seedlings from, or you get your seedlings. But I would recommend being careful where you get your seedlings from, because sometimes they can be sitting in a shop for a while, and if they're sitting there and they've done nothing in the shop for a few weeks, then when you get them, they'll take a lot of effort to regrow, and they might never get to that production stage that you want. So I'd highly recommend anyone who's looking for seedlings. So Di Bickford has a seedling stall at Wollonga markets and at Goodwood markets. She's down at McLaren Vale, and she does.
We've got herbs at McLaren Vale. On the road.
Okay, yeah.
Really
so they would sell herbs, yeah.
Yeah, they have some seedlings.
Okay.
Really great.
It's good to get them from growers who basically have a smaller amount and their turnover is constant, because then you know that the plants are constantly growing rather than sitting and kind of going through stages, yeah.
So if you ask her, she'll go out and have a look and bring it in. So yeah, we're just starting.
She's all over the place. Great.
So, well, if we've got no more questions about what to plant, then the next biggest thing that people like to know about is your pests and diseases. So I've got a list of things here that we'll go through. The first one is to mulch or not to mulch. That's my question. What's your answers?
Yes.
Mulch. Well, I mulch.
Mulch?
Yeah, I'm a mulcher. Only because it makes it even neater.
Mm-hmm.
Winter, but mulch.
So we're getting into the broader question of, do we mulch all year or not? What do people think about that?
Yes.
Well, I do.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that you get critters living in your mulch in winter that might attack your plants?
Yes, I do.
So that can be an issue with mulch, depending on what type of mulch you use. So I know a lot of market gardeners who will just go, nah, in winter, bare soil.
Yeah, my little caddy man did that.
And when I was living in Mount Barker years ago, we basically had to have bare soil in winter, otherwise the slugs and the snails would just smash anything and everything we planted. What I find is that you can also have a mix. Like here, this is at our community garden in Goodwood. People are using the old, like the yogurt containers. So they've still got their mulch, but around inside the yogurt container, they've planted their seedling. And then that keeps the bugs from getting in whilst the plant's too small. So usually the worst time is when the seedlings or the little plants are small. They're the most susceptible, and that's when, you know, even just a bite on the stem can just knock the whole thing over. So getting it through that stage and getting them growing out, and then you can just lift it off, and then that can help to prevent those issues. So things that like living in the mulch are obviously in winter the slugs and the snails. Is anyone in an area where earwigs are an issue? You would be. I've got friends who live just out of Yankalilla. They've got market garden there. If you kind of lift your foot, it's like, oh, there's 20 earwigs under there. And earwigs, small amounts, they don't do much, but if you've got a lot of them, they will smash your seedlings and plants. And they like living they basically eat mulch and wood and anything
You don't have too many,
like that.
I'll say. I'm lucky, but I guess
Mm-hmm.
don't know. Got everything else.
Slater control, because I find they just bring back everything.
Yep, slaters at large. So slaters are also, so there's the good and the bad side to all these pests. So slaters are fantastic at breaking down your compost. But in large numbers around your veggie beds, they can smash your veggie beds too. So there's this interesting dichotomy of we've got to live with these creatures and have a healthy environment and accept some amount of pest damage, but there are times when we need to actually intervene to go, well, no, actually, I want to get my crop of broccoli, please, and how do we actually achieve that whilst doing minimal impact on the broader population. So I find I still have my mulch on now, but when I plant the seedlings, I have a bare area of just about 15 to 20 centimetres around each seedling. And that seems to be enough because the little critters live under the mulch, but they don't venture out too far. And it seems to be the right balance for our space. So that yogurt container is another really effective way of doing it, just for the first few weeks and then lift them off and then it's fine. I do tend to have less mulch in winter because some things can build up, but we're pretty lucky where I am that we don't have too many slugs and snail problems. That can be the biggest issue with the mulch, but a lot of critters can live under there and be closer to your seedlings than you'd like to. So when the plants grow up, then usually those kind of insects they don't cause that much damage. Then it becomes issues like the cabbage, the green cabbage moth, so they do damage the whole time. Or sometimes those native, like the little furry fuzzy wuzzy caterpillars, which I used to love as a kid, but so they're actually a native, so they're important to not just demolish as a species, but so I kind of tend to notice that they'll attack a few different plants that I don't mind. If I just see them, like last year they got onto our borage and I was like, that's okay, you can have our borage, that's fine. But I was just watching, if they became too much of an issue, I would just very carefully target a couple of plants that they were causing a bit too much damage, but making sure that their general population was enough so we need the good and the bad insects. So that's all part of our ecosystems, whether we're in the cities or the country areas. So I've got here, prevention is the best cure and pest predators are your best defence. So that gets into this idea of we really need to have different shrubs and plants which will encourage our pest predators. So providing flowers all year round, so things like our native bees, so wasps. For your aphids, the best pest predator is the ladybird, which the ladybird and the ladybird larvae can eat up to 800 aphids a day. Lacewing, quite a lot of different wasps, even the paper wasp, which is pretty nasty if you get near one of the paper wasp nests. But if you're not near their nest, then they don't do you any harm at all. They'll fly around the garden, as long as you're not near their nest, they don't do any harm. And they actually they help to deal with the little green brassica, like the cabbage moth caterpillar. You've probably all seen them on your brassicas, like little kind of almost fluorescent green colour. They start about this big and then within about 2 days they're that big and they've eaten all your leaves.
How do we keep baby birds in our gardens?
Having things like allowing a bit of milk thistle weed to grow, because that's also a good, what do you call it? So a sacrificial plant, because it often, if the aphids come, they'll attack the milk thistle weeds first, and then you'll be able to watch that, and then if they spread, then you can start controlling, but that will encourage the ladybirds. The main thing is to have some perennial plants around with different food for them and different kind of like habitats and kind of, so just having basically clear lawn and nothing else won't be any good. But if you have a whole, like your native shrubs and ground covers, some bigger trees, some like a whole range of, then yeah, I can't say magically they'll appear, but they also need food to want to come. So if there's no food there for them, then they won't come in. Other things with the pest predators are having a water supply, having some habitat, especially for things like little lizards and skinks. So blue-tongue lizards are fantastic at eating your snails and slugs. Having water supply is really good. So if you've got a pond and you've got frogs, frogs are fantastic pest predators. They will eat all sorts of stuff. Having a bird bath and having some habitat and places for birds to come in and sit and look around your garden, just even some poles around the place that you have for your trellising, that can be incredibly good at getting the willy wagtails and the the New England honeyeater, some of the different birds that come in, and they will just go for your pests.
And the blackbirds.
The blackbirds, they can be good and bad. So they do some fantastic work and they do some damage as well.
It's the fantastic work they do, I love to know.
Oh, they eat a lot of bugs that are not good for your garden.
Yeah.
But yeah, they also dig up and stuff and cause lots of damage too. So all of this is a balance, but having a good environment that's, you know, you're not doing all this work yourself. You're saying the nature can play a part of your whole pest strategy.
So can I ask on that topic about the native bees? So they pollinate, don't they, a lot of ours?
Yes.
That we want pollinated. So this goes the same way, like you plant the plants that the native bees like? Is there any more that you can do?
Is there any information, so I'm sure that there's Green Adelaide and the councils have got info on what plants they like to eat. So building the pest, like the insect hotels.
Yeah, I did build an insect hotel and no one came to live in it. So
Cheeky of them.
That's why.
We can send you we'll send everyone a follow-up email with some of the links we've mentioned, and I'll follow up some links about native bees as well.
Oh, thank you. I did get a book out of the library. It said there are 1,500 species, and so you have to have a organic hotel with all different kinds of floors.
And some of them like living under you, kind of like on the ground, even in holes. Some of them, like, yeah, you have to have.
And I read that some of them, the blue banded bees, which I really like, they're so pretty and they don't sting, they live in the soil. So that the book recommended that you have an area of soil that you really don't clean up ever.
Yep.
You just have a few places in your garden where you don't actually scratch anything away and rake.
So
You just leave it and they go and live there.
good examples of plants. So you can have like some perennials that are just really easy to maintain, and they just cover the ground, and you don't really have to do anything. They can even be under your fruit trees, and they don't do much other than provide lots of flowers and fruit and provide habitat and create that space that no one really touches. So that's a salvia. So salvias are fantastic. They're really water efficient. They'll grow through that. There's hundreds of different varieties. Most of them are perennial. They'll cover the ground at different heights and shapes. You know, there should be something for everyone. And they provide a lot of this habitat, and they flower a lot of the year. So they provide good food for bees and native bees as well. That one's, I call it Aromaphila, but a lot of people call it Aromaphila, or what would you call it, Jess? Aromaphila. So that's a native plant, again very water efficient, and there's all sorts of different heights and shapes. They've got a beautiful flower. One of them that grows in just north of Port Augusta is called emu bush, and that's got fantastic medicinal properties. Just a great plant to have around for habitat, for space. And then this one is the ruby red saltbush. The little fruit, there's one fruit there. It's really tasty. It's kind of a little bit sweet, a little bit salty. Really good for, like, you know, basically great tucker just for eating. And it just spreads across the ground, and you don't really have to do much at all to it. And again, it covers the ground and provides really good habitat.
What's its name again?
That one's a ruby red saltbush. Ruby red saltbush. Because it has beautiful red fruit. But don't try and infuse it in gin. I tried it because the colour was so good, and I was like, oh, it's going to make and it's kind of like sweet and salty, and I thought that'll be really nice in a nice dry gin. And for 2 weeks it looked stunning. And then pulled the fruit out. It tasted really nice, but then something in the coloration just kept on going, and then it kind of went a bit yellowy and then a bit orangey, and then it went brown. Still tasted good. Didn't look good. I thought, oh yeah, Christmas gin, that'll be fantastic to give to people. Nah. But, so there's just a few examples of really good plants that will help to increase that habitat. And they, you know, if you plant them other than your veggie bed and in areas, and they actually go really well under fruit trees because they don't actually take up much water and they don't compete much. They provide layers and structure to your garden. So a couple more things we've got on here. Hand picking is the most effective pesticide, always. So when broccoli and all the brassicas, the cauliflowers, the cabbages are in full swing, I just go out for 2 minutes a day, look over all the leaves, squash, squash. It's the best way to deal with it. So if you're a bit icky with them, pair of gloves, it's fine, but it's just the best way to deal with it. Then you don't ever have to use a pesticide, because we just don't want to go there. I mean, I can tell you lots of natural pesticides to use, but even so, if you just go out there and you just look under the leaves, usually they're on the stems on the inside, and they start off really small, they get bigger quite quickly, and you just have a look over all the leaves each day. And that's enough to keep the numbers down so they won't affect your outcome. And it's the same for a lot of the pests. And I've got lovely chickens up there because they're just fantastic pests, predators, and if you get a plant that's just infested, just throw it into your chickens and they'll demolish all the pests and just keep the numbers down. They do like slugs and snails, but not that many. They love earwigs, so if you have a big earwig problem, then baits and traps, which we'll look into. So an open container, if you say, imagine this is just a drink water bottle, or whatever, and you can just basically cut that top off, and you put linseed oil in the bottom, a little bit of something sweet, a little bit of soy sauce as well. Although a friend's dog got into that and he was like eating all the earwigs out of it. It's like, oh yeah. But then the chickens absolutely go nuts over it. So, and that basically all the earwigs come in and just absolutely love it. And I can tell you a few other earwig specialties as well, because they can be really full on. But that's a really good earwig one, and then the chickens absolutely love it. The other great things about chickens is if you have them under your fruit trees, then they will deal with insects that will basically lay their larvae in the ground and then crawl up the trees, and then they create the problems in the next year. So codling moth is a really bad one for pears and some apples and quinces. And once that's in your garden, it's hard. But the chickens, so the cycle is that they'll get into the fruit, and then the fruit drops, and then they lay there, basically, or the larvae come out, and then they drop into the ground, or they lay their eggs in the ground, and then that comes up the next year as the worms. So if you've got your chickens, basically they'll dig through, eat all the eggs, and they'll basically cut that cycle. And heaven forbid we actually have fruit fly become worse than it is. I really hope we don't, and I hope everyone's doing everything they can. We're in a fruit fly zone where we are, and it's really bad. But chickens really help because the fruit fly have that same cycle where they'll, like the larvae eggs will be in the ground for the next year, and they hatch into the larvae and then turn into the flies. So they can help to stop that cycle.
So what's some natural ways to control the fruit fly?
Once you've got it, it's minimisation, which is why we want to, like, you know, the sterilisation program that they're doing is hopefully the best way of preventing it or getting rid of it, but it also takes everyone to do the right thing in terms of their own fruit trees and not sharing the fruit and not spreading it and trying to clean up all the fruit on the ground and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's a huge issue, which I hope we don't have to deal with long term. So this was taken today. This is at my partner's school, Craigburn Primary School. They have not white cockatoos, corellas come in and smash the plants. And they just love like playing around, and they'll kind of, especially the young seedlings. So this is a way to stop the corellas from getting the new broccoli and cauliflower seedlings. And they're like the sunflowers, they just come in and snap the stems and all sorts of stuff. And they don't do too, like once the plants are up, it seems to be pretty okay, but just in that initial stages and just certain plants. So having these hoops is a really good way of, you can throw stuff over if you need to, and then in summer if you get your heat waves you can throw your white shade cloth over as well. So they can be a really good part of your veggie garden system to be able to either protect from things, or especially in summer to give them some shade for your young seedlings. So I talked a bit about baits and traps. Another one to mention with your snails and slugs is, again, getting, say, a water bottle, cut open a flap on the top so it lifts up like that. Some cheap nasty beer, or if you want, you can put some like yeast and water and sugar, maybe a bit of old fruit, and they'll come in and they'll go in there and they'll drown. And it does work, and it just helps to keep them away from your veggie garden enough to get what you need. So in England we were trying to grow beans, and it was like, you never grow beans here, there's too many slugs, and the slugs are about that big. And we had about 4 around each bed as our guards, and we cleaned them out each day, and it worked. Our beans grew.
Need a lot of beer though.
Cheap. There's a lot of cheap crappy beer over there. They have Foster's in the UK.
Yeah.
Cheap and nasty. So, natural remedies, as in pesticides. So, I don't use pyrethrum because it's really strong. You can, but if you do, you have to be really targeted, and it has to actually get what you want. So if you've got a really bad infestation of stuff, then that can work. But for all of your small little critters, especially your aphids, your whitefly, all of those small ones, a soap-based spray or a white oil spray is the most effective. And you can add things like a bit of neem oil. So neem oil you can buy from the honey shop in town, or most Indian supermarkets will have neem oil. In India they turn it, they have it in soap and toothpaste and all sorts of stuff. Like it's, you know, if you had a lot yourself, it would be bad, but it's not toxic for humans. And it's by far a lot better for the environment and for all other beneficial animals than pyrethrum. You can add a bit of chili and garlic because that really does help as well. There's a lot of recipes online for how to make, even how to make your own white oil. White oil is basically just industrial soap and water. So it's the same as making a soap spray. So a very simple one is just to get 1/6 of a block of soap, put it in, say like 1 litre of water. You boil it up and simmer it for about 15 minutes because the soap has to dissolve through the water. And you can add some chili and garlic if you want. Let it cool, add a few drops of neem oil. So a whole one of those, if you bought a thing of like 10 mils of neem oil, you'd only use like 1/2 ml for a full one of those. And then that's enough to do a lot of plants. And I definitely recommend getting something a bit better quality like this than the cheap little hand sprayers because it lasts longer, it's more targeted, and you know it's all throwaway plastic, so it's better to get something better quality that you throw away less. And if people want specific recipes, I can chat afterwards as well. When we look at weed management, most weeds are actually pretty good. And actually you can grow your own weeds to really make the most of what weeds you have. But some weeds you need to get rid of. And this one, so you have to dig right down. And that one I dug right down, but I didn't get the bulb at the bottom. So that's just going to regrow.
And what is that?
So it's like a little lily, but it sends seed out, but it also grows, it spreads little rhizomes and tubers underground. So eventually it'll just spread and you won't be able to grow anything else there. This will just basically be the dominant plant. So I have to get in there and I've got nothing else growing in that section until I get rid of this. And this just comes up in the winter. So I'm waiting till it comes up and then I'm just going to get down. So I've done it once last winter. So this year I'm estimating that I'll probably get 5% of what's left come up again. And then I'll get rid of the rest of them, and then they'll be gone. So there are plants like your kikuyu and your couch grass and your nut grass, and they're weeds which you have to have an effective way to try and get rid of them because they will eventually be the dominant plant in your veggie beds and won't let other things be productive. Even in fruit trees and especially citrus trees, they just will not be productive if you've got that around. So there's lots of ways and means of dealing with them, and we're not going to go into that tonight because weed management's a whole day worth of talking and planning, but it's good to think about, good to identify what weeds you've got and to know that most weeds are actually pretty useful and there's just a few that you need to have a plan for. And wicking beds are a great way of going, well, okay, I'm going to separate my garden, my growing area from the ground so that you can just stop those kind of weeds from coming in. And when we were at Sellex, we had basically kikuyu ground where the good garden bed areas were, so we just made big wicking beds, and that was the best way to go about it. I have successfully got kikuyu out of whole yards before. It's a matter of persistence and working slowly but surely and getting rid of it. But for a lot of weeds, like so here there's a picture of winter grasses coming up. This is up in Mount Barker where we were doing a big permablitz or working bee.
Question.
Yes.
Isn't kikuyu a type of lawn?
Yes.
Is that,
And so is couch grass.
is that bad to have that as a grass lawn
No,
thing?
if you want a lawn. It's not useful if you want to have a veggie garden there.
But wouldn't you say, if you're installing a lawn and you also wanted to have a veggie garden somewhere, would you choose a different grass variety?
That's a difficult one because they're the best ones for having low watering lawns.
So we're currently
So-
in the process of putting a lawn down.
Yep.
A week away. We have to
Yep.
decide on the species.
Yep.
What-
Yeah. So.
Your trees is
So
insane.
what you can do then is to make sure you've got a really good path and then barrier.
No room.
You don't have room between your lawn and your veggie beds.
Also, the lawn will go up to where the veggie, so there's swimming pools that we
Yep.
about.
Mm-hmm.
And a lawn, and then along the lawn there'll be some lemon trees,
Okay.
citrus,
Yep.
then hedges, and then where the lawn ends there'll be an area with shed, like pool shed and garden shed, and between that lawn ending and the shed there'll be like raised garden beds
Yep.
and fruit trees.
Yep. So the raised garden beds are a good way to be able to stop it. And borders and paths are really important because they can be a barrier between the kikuyu and your garden bed.
So edging.
So the edging, so you can actually get edging that goes right down into the ground. And so your raised garden beds could be, if they're wicking beds, then they're completely separated from the ground. But if you do raised beds that are in the ground, then I'd recommend being able to dig down, like basically dig a barrier in. So like if you have galvanised iron edging for your raised beds, to make sure that it goes in the ground to a deeper level. But even if your path is that far between your lawn,
Oh, there is no path, it's just
no, but if you're able to create a barrier between your lawn and your veggie beds, like just, then that distance is where you maintain,
to avoid the edging because the dog is
well,
hatching on the edging.
so if your lawn grows right up to the edge of your garden bed, then the kikuyu will grow underneath and up into your veggie bed. So that's,
What would you recommend then? Like, just tell the gardener to put down different, like, bring in a different.
It's going to tell you not to put
well, I don't know enough about lawn varieties to know which one will be less, like, so talk to him through the problem and say that you want, like, you know, because you want something that's fairly low maintenance in terms of watering. I would definitely recommend that kikuyu is actually easier to deal with than couch grass, which is another lawn variety, and having that in your veggie beds is actually worse than kikuyu. So out of those two, I would choose kikuyu. But there's a lot of different lawn varieties, and I don't know enough about them to know which ones will be least invasive to actually go into your veggie bed. But digging down, like, so if you kind of can get the galvanised iron, at least, you know,
Like a metre? Or
if you could do a metre, that would be fantastic, and that will basically block it. But the kikuyu can grow down quite a depth and then come up again. So a metre would deal with most of it.
the lemon trees and the citrus less productive.
But if you have, again, you don't want it to grow up to around the lemon tree completely.
Designing is doing that.
So because lemon trees are shallow rooted, and they will, so basically lemon trees I would recommend just having mulch and almost bare, but always mulched, but nothing else competing with them. So at our place we've actually got these ones growing, and they kind of grow under the citrus trees, but from a distance, because they've got their roots and then they'll just kind of spread out over the ground. So then they're kind of covering the ground, but they don't actually compete for nutrient. So citrus trees are really shallow rooted. So if you have grass competing at the same level where the roots of the citrus are, the grass will outcompete your citrus and you won't get many fruit. So that's going to be a constant battle that's going on. So some people have, like, again, you have like kind of barrier around, like a ring barrier around where you plant your citrus to help to keep the grass out. But again, that needs reasonably regular maintenance to help to keep the kikuyu down. So it's an interesting one. Gardening is always this balance of like, you know, things are always trying to get back to being wild and jungle. That's how nature works. So it's kind of our way of trying to manage it so we get good production and get what we want, but not kind of destroying nature. We're trying to work with it rather than fight against it.
I've got a comfrey plant under both my lemon and lime.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recommend keeping it there or getting it out? Like it just, I chop it and it just, within a week it's back.
How productive are your citrus trees?
My lime, I reckon she's struggling, but then it's only about a year and a half old. But lemons, that's gone crazy. But I have dug one of them out, but the other ones too, you know, because I just put it in to get the nutrients going in the ground.
So comfrey grows really deep. It can grow down metres.
Is that right?
In the right soil. But it doesn't spread, it spreads more over time.
Right.
So you can actually just chop bits of the root off and replant it elsewhere.
Yeah.
So it will impact on where the comfrey is, but comfrey doesn't have a lot of spreading out problems so much. So it would be better to have it somewhere else if you can move it over time.
Yeah.
Other fruit trees are much better at having competition around them. So your prunus, all of your like nectarines and peaches, they don't mind a few things, plums, apples and pears and that. They're very much more deep-rooted and they don't mind having other plants and herbs and things around them. So it depends on what you want as well. So does it go back to the So our nectarine there, you can see there's comfrey underneath. And then lots of other herbs and plants, and it just doesn't mind it at all. We've also got our compost there, because we move our compost around and that feeds under the fruit trees as we make the compost. But yeah, this is our, you have to be careful, you can't do too much. And it depends as well, like our landlord had planted rhubarb under there thinking that would be fine, but the rhubarb actually hates the competition. So it hasn't affected these, but these have said, like, stop the rhubarb from growing. So our rhubarb is basically dead now.
Yeah, because my comfrey's just gone crazy.
That's another interesting one. Soursops. Who's got soursops? Woohoo! And they can be a real pain, depending on things, but also in the right circumstance. I know farmers, broad scale, who actually love the soursops because they grow up now before some other weeds which are really bad grow. They basically cover the soil, cover the ground, other stuff doesn't grow, and then it dies back, and then it doesn't compete in spring and summer for nutrients and water when they don't want the competition. And they range geese and chickens and that through there, and it's not a problem for them. So they're like, yay, soursops. But in a home garden, soursops are a different story. And the best thing, so you can weaken them to the point of, like, the bulbs will die if you just keep on at them. You don't have to pull the bulbs up, but if you can, that's great. But just simply pulling the top off constantly, eventually the bulb will run out of energy.
I was thinking putting more mulch, so would that help or not?
If you used a really...
The pathways.
Yeah, so pathways do a cardboard and then put your mulch on top of the cardboard. So that's what I do for all my paths, is basically cardboard and then wood chips on top. And then that stops all your weeds for the next year and a half and kind of breaks down, turns into soil. Put that on your garden beds, replace it with new cardboard and mulch. So that certainly helps to reduce the soursops. I've got down here, grow your own weeds. So why would I do that?
Some are edible.
Some are edible, absolutely. And there's a lot of vegetables which actually love self-seeding and proliferating all through your garden. And also, I'm choosing plants that have got high nutrient value so that when I feed my compost and my chickens and my worms, I'm actually cycling really high nutrient value plants through my system constantly. So that's going to help the outcome of the production and give me better quality fruit and vegetables at the end of it. So dandelion is one of those, which is great because the bees love it and the leaves are really high quality. It's a great tonic. Nettle, who's got nettle? So nettle, it does sting, yes, but it makes a fantastic, so you can cut the tops off them, braise them in a good tea. If you kind of saute them in a little bit of butter, a little bit of white wine, a bit of salt and pepper. When I was staying in France, this lady did that and I was like, oh, that was really good. But the European nettle is a lot stingier than the Australian nettle. The Australian nettle is actually quite mild. So, but nettle is fantastic nutrient value. So if you give it to your chickens or your compost or make like liquid teas out of it, it's brilliant for your garden. So parsley, once you've got parsley self-seeding everywhere, just let one parsley plant seed, grab all the seeds, I've got heaps of seed here, spread it around, it'll grow up where it wants to. We've just got so much parsley it outcompetes the other weeds. Silver beet, kale, rocket, borage, they all love self-seeding everywhere. So I just basically, as soon as I move somewhere, I'll just spread the seed around everywhere, and then kind of you have to manage it for the first little while, and then that grows up. That basically blocks, it becomes a living mulch. Other stuff can't grow so well, and that becomes my weeds. So I can eat some, compost some, rotate it as I want. So your weeds become a production line. And I wanted to go back to this because there are the running grasses which we talked about, which are really bad. Well, not, they can be managed, but they are more difficult to manage, like your cooch and your kikuyu. But all of your clumping grasses, if you manage to deal with them quickly, so your winter grass, that's a clumping grass, so it doesn't spread by running along and then sending up new shoots, it just grows from the one clump. They're actually quite easy to manage.
I don't like them too.
So they're harder on a broad scale. And if you get your clumping grasses 3 or 4 years old, that's a lot harder to dig out.
Yeah.
I work on a 20-acre property at Coromandel Valley and she's got some good clumping grasses there. But generally they're quite easy to manage. We managed to dig that bunch out in about 20 minutes. We were putting in a pond. Okay, so winter fertilizing. So we talked about pre-fertilizing and finding some good composts or some good manure and adding some good organic fertilizer and preparing your beds. So that's really important before every crop to replenish your beds. Regular top-ups are really good. So I've got a few worm farms at my house, which are just, I've been doing it for years, and I find it's very easy to maintain if you have them in a good spot. So in Adelaide, that means they're completely sheltered with grapes and under a plum tree in summer. And then in winter, that drops all its leaves and it gets nice sun because the worms like it. Fairly cool, but they do like a bit of heat in winter. But summer they really struggle if they're out exposed in the sun. But the regular worm tea is good. Regular sea sole, so seaweed. So don't confuse sea sole as a complete fertiliser. Unfortunately, it's not that clear on the bottle, but it doesn't actually have any nitrogen in it. It's a brilliant tonic, and it's great for dealing with certain types of fungus problems. And seaweed's a great kind of controller of fungus, so you can spray it directly on your plants, but not on a hot sunny day. But it does help like that. Then we were talking before, so these, don't know if you can see it from there, the pipes that we've put directly into our beds that we've got for our worms. So you can use buckets with holes in the bottom, and you bury your buckets about 3/4 into the ground. But for your wicking beds, I'd basically be looking at getting some big plastic piping, and you bury it. So if you're down to your, what are you using as your kind of, are you using geotech?
Yeah, geotech membrane,
Yeah, so you don't want it to go down to the bottom of that, so about 5 centimetres, 10 centimetres above that, and just dig it, bury it in, and then you can put manure. If you do put scraps in there, like kitchen scraps, make sure you cover the top so the rats can't get in. So that's really important, otherwise you end up with a rat problem. So you can, what we did was just drill holes into the side of it, so nice big holes so the worms can just get in and out, and then you just have to seed it with worms. Seed it with garden worms, not worm farm worms, because the worm farm worms can live in the soil, but they're actually from the subtropics, and they're not so used to living in Adelaide soils. So if you've got a good friend with good soil, like compost with worms already, so grab some of those, because they're much more adapted to our conditions.
So the worms that you call garden worms, are they native worms?
Yep.
They're Australian worms. But if I go and buy worm farm worms, they're like foreign worms.
I don't know if some of them are from Australia, but from the subtropics. I'm not completely sure. Just have to listen to them, and if they kind of go A at the end of the sentence, then they're from Queensland.
Yeah,
But
I don't know any worms really. I'm just wondering if we're stuffing our ecology by having all these worms and buying worms and putting our garden beds when they're probably foreign worms and don't even come from Australia.
I think there's unfortunately a misnomer of people thinking that the worms that you buy are actually for the soil, because our worms live in the soil, and all you need to do is actually, like in the dry, they'll go right down, and so you won't see them. It's not until you actually have good soil and enough water that they'll come up and you'll see them. And if then you give them enough food, and the food that they need is just lots of compost. Yeah.
But if I go and buy a bucket of worms somewhere, they could be any kind of worm.
So they're meant to be for worm farms like this, which is separated from the soil.
But do they escape into the environment?
Maybe a few, but very rarely.
They don't survive very well.
They would really struggle in summer. So within a wicking bed system, you probably could get away with it more easily because it's separate, but some might come out the overflow pipe. But the thing is that because a wicking bed is a separated system and it's more controlled, moist content wise and soil temperature wise, those worms would do better than if I put, so these ones I went to, basically I got worms from the soil from a place that I worked at where there was heaps of worms in the ground, and I just populated these because these were actually raised beds that were just on mulch and cardboard, so they're still going to go into the ground eventually. But yeah, I wouldn't buy worms for doing the in-bed worm farms. I would try and find native worms because they do exactly the same job, and they're more resilient and used to the conditions.
Thanks.
And as long as these types of worm farms are really easy to look after, because if you don't water them for a while, the worms will just disappear back into the ground. And then when you water it and feed it, then the worms will come back up. Whereas these ones, if I let them dry out, the worms will die. So, any more composting questions?
In my composting bin, I've got one of those come up and down as you described. Sometimes I open the lid and there's worms all around the inside of the plastic, sitting there. And sometimes I open the lid and they're not there at all.
The same happens with these.
Is it good to have them sitting on the plastic, or does it mean I made them too wet?
No, I'm not sure why they do it. It might be that it is quite moist, but they'll regulate themselves. So, no, I wouldn't worry about that. The main thing with those ones, so getting back again to, going the wrong way, is that you have to make sure you put mesh underneath, like little bird mesh, to stop rats from going up and into your compost. Because we have different systems at my place for like where we put our kitchen scraps. So our kitchen scraps only go in these compost bins or to our worm farm. And when we get chickens soon, they'll go to our chickens, but not much. Just careful, because it's a great way to attract rats. So you can prevent the rats just by having the mesh that you don't attach permanently, you just kind of fold it up and over. That way the rats can't get under, and it just prevents what can be a really bad problem.
There's a really short video by, is it Hannah from Gardening Australia, showing how to do that.
Yep. I recommend anything that Hannah says and does. She's brilliant. And if you ever get to Tassie, you see her pink house on top of the hill in Hobart. She used to be an Adelaide girl. So, watering. So to get good veggie production, you'll find that you still need to water in winter. You just have to be aware of, you can basically turn your automatic systems off, but just be aware that there still needs to be a regular amount of water to make sure that you end up with your good size, good amount of production. But obviously you can be, if there's quite a bit of rain, you can stop your watering. And just keep testing your soil moisture rather than watering before you check. So, and just keep an eye on the plants. One thing I do find in winter is that a lot of the plants, like our chili bushes here, will kind of basically go dormant. So if you give them too much water, it can rot the roots because they're not using the water, because they're not growing that much. So they'll lose most of their leaves. They'll look a bit straggly. So they do need enough moisture, but generally we just, the rainfall is enough. If it's dry for a couple of weeks, we'll give it a bit of water. But they don't actually use that much. So your veggies will keep on using a lot of water because they're wanting to grow and get to the end of their cycle quickly, whether it be 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. But your longer term plants, like your herbs and spices, if they're dying off in the winter, going dormant, they don't need that much water. And your fruit trees as well generally won't need that much. Citrus need a bit because they're coming into their fruiting time, so you need to be careful. If it's quite dry and you don't water them, you'll end up with quite small citrus. So you might need to pump it up a few times with some water to get them through. Any other watering questions? Microclimates. So this gets back to what I was talking about at first, and it kind of is part of how we look at it through permaculture and look at it through our observations of what's going on. So this wall here is a north-facing wall, and this bed here, so there's not a driveway but a walking path. This is really hot in summer, so it's really struggled. But we've managed to get a bit of lettuce through, mainly because it's it's been cool, and it's also under the shade of this tree. But in winter this tree will drop its leaves, And the good thing is that this is actually going to be a really good winter production area because it gets the east and then the north. So the east is the road. So basically this will get full half-day sun on the wall, and that'll create a really sheltered microclimate. So it'll be great for growing more kind of difficult to grow stuff in winter. So our coriander, our lettuce, different plants like that, this would be a great spot for it. So when you're going around the house, you can look at, so what are the areas that are protected from the cold winds? What are the areas that might be good for creating a warmer area? Large pots are really good for keeping the soil warmer. So in winter your soil gets quite cold, so some things don't like that so much. But when they're in pots and they're above the ground, the soil temperature stays warmer, so it means that you've got a bit more ability to grow things that otherwise wouldn't like it. That's another reason why we have our chilies in pots. And this is near our back veranda, stays out of the wind, it's quite a sheltered spot. They stay warmer. So this chili bush here is about 3 years old now. So it gets through the winter. And this year we've probably got 150 chilies from it. And hopefully it'll do another couple of seasons.
So you don't cut it back or?
Trim off the dead stuff, that's about it. Just at the beginning of the season you can see, when it starts sprouting, you can see which is the dead branches and which are not, and just trim off the dead ones and let it keep going.
Is the same with capsicum plants?
No. Sometimes you can get a second season out of them, but I find they're hit and miss. So they will often last through the winter, but then sometimes if you try and get them through the winter, then watch them for the first month. If they start really shooting out, then let them go, and then you should get some good crop off them the second year. But sometimes they'll just kind of sit there and just do nothing, even when everything else is growing again in spring, and that means that they're just not going to take. So eggplants are the same. You can, like in the tropics, you can get eggplants 2 or 3 years old, but they just struggle with the cold, and it kind of knocks them out, and they often just don't come back, unfortunately. That was frost on our little kale. So if you've got frosty areas, there are a lot of plants which don't mind it, and a lot of plants which will just melt and not come back, sadly. So if you've got an area which is susceptible to frost, then there are plenty of plants which you can grow there through the winter which don't mind it, and then just avoid other ones which don't like it at all. So these ones, I think that was a little broccoli actually, that didn't mind it at all. But yeah, you do have to be careful. And again, back to these types of plants, the perennial trees and shrubs and ground covers, that will actually moderate the climate because they're creating different heights, so the air temperature can't be even over the ground. Because there's coverage on the ground, it actually prevents the frost from sitting there. So that can actually change the microclimate around enough to make it better for your plants.
Lachlan, if you don't have any, if you've got a bare site and you're starting from scratch and you've got experiencing lots of wind, is there anything else while you're waiting for those shrubs to grow, anything else you can put in place in the meantime to help?
With the wind?
Yes.
It's an interesting one. I've tried that at our friend's farm at Yankalilla, and we put in big star pickets and put shade cloth, and it actually, the star pickets bent. Like the wind was so strong on the hill, they actually bent over. We realised that with the shade cloth we were using was too thick, so you need a very, like 50% flow through at highest. Might do that, but yeah, until the plants grow up to provide that wind. You can do smaller barriers in between, to help to kind of slow the wind down over space, and kind of creating it like, so as you're creating your space, don't just have one break, but have multiple, so then that can like flow through. And but yeah, that it does actually help, but you have to be careful how you construct it.
Big holes in it though, the wind would go through a bit better.
Yeah, even then it's still like the top of the hills of Yankalilla, it's just like, whoa. Yeah. So, but yeah, we used I think 70% shade cloth, which only allowed us less wind. So if we had have used a much lighter shade cloth and put holes through it, it does help for that first season or two. And probably we should have just used like just cemented in poles.
Spotted gum posts, big ones that I'll put in for bananas to stop the wind.
Yep.
And then scaffolding, shade cloth, it's stronger. Next level up.
Yeah, so that does the job when you need to. Okay, I think we've got about 15 minutes left. So we've got a couple more things to look at. I wanted to look at fruit trees. So this is at Claire. Sylvie isn't being planted. She's just managing the situation. So make sure you're aware, especially in small spaces, where you plant your trees, and just think about their maximum height. So how big they are going to grow to in 10, 20 years, and what that might mean in terms of how it might block the sun, and how it might change the wind, and the different impact on what grows underneath. So in our yard, most of it was really well planned by the landlords and by the people who lived there before. But there's one apple tree which was planted on the north side of the backyard, which has grown up, and it's a really beautiful tree and it's great apples, but unfortunately it shades out because apples take a lot longer to lose their leaves than other fruit trees. So it's shading out two of our main veggie beds for a lot of the sun in winter. So it's actually was a tree that should have gone on the southern side of the yard, so that in the winter, when the sun's to the north, it doesn't actually block the sun out. So when you're planting your fruit trees, just think about how big it's going to get and what impact it might make on the other plants that you want to grow. So there's a really good website. I think it's always hard when you say websites because you never know how long they're going to last for and if they're still around, but I think this one still works. It's called Suncalc, suncalc.net. And are you going to check it out now for me?
I'll find it and pop the link. If I can find it, I'll pop the link.
So basically you type in where you are, and then you can type in any date of the year, and it'll show you the tracking of the sun from sunrise to sunset in relation to your property. So it'll show you where the sun and where the shade is. Because the sun moves a lot in the winter, it goes more to the north, and in the summer it comes higher to vertical. But then in between it kind of moves, so it can make a huge amount of difference on where the sun comes in and where it doesn't. So that's...
Yes, I made that mistake, because it'll go whole and planted all these things, and 15 years later it's like, that probably shouldn't have gone there.
When I lived in the tropics, it's actually even weirder because it goes from there to there, so it's not like there to there, it's like, so on one side of the house it can actually be completely shady on one side in the wet season or the dry season compared to the other time. So yeah, it's a really good one to look at in terms of where you're putting your trees. So just think about, like, do as much planning as you can first, because it'll prevent mistakes and moving of things in the future. Winter is great for most fruit trees, but not for things like subtropical trees, and citrus is one of those. So you plant your citrus in your spring because it needs the warmer soil temperature to get going. So hold off on them. But all your apple trees and all like pears and quinces and nectarines and peaches and all of those fruit trees, winter's the best time because it's when they're most dormant. Your other subtropical trees and things like bananas, if you're keen to grow them, and I've grown a lot of bananas in the tropics, so I can tell you all about them. Most people think, oh, just look, it'll grow up there, or just put it in this little corner. And they actually create a clump as big as this space here over time if they grow well enough.
Do you know Don that's in Goodwood? He's banana, last year's got 300 or something of banana plants in his backyard.
Wow.
And 50 odd varieties of apples and mangoes and you name it.
In Goodwood?
In Goodwood.
How big's his land?
800 maybe, whatever. It is
wow.
dense. It's pretty amazing.
I'll have to find and get his number from you. Oh, keen to visit. Ah, okay,
And
cool.
It's pretty.
Great.
Walk around for 5 or 6 hours.
Yep. Great, that sounds good. So yeah, check, like, you know, there's heaps of plant experts out there where you buy your fruit trees from. They'll, you know, if they're good, they'll tell you as well. Balhana Nurseries up in they're a really good one to get your fruit trees from. There's a few good places. Food Forests do the best figs.
Perry's Nursery up in
Down south.
Meadows Way, yeah?
Yeah, they're pretty good. They've got good quality trees. Yeah, I think, well, there's quite a few. I'd get them from a specialised nursery than I would from a kind of a garden centre, because people know what they're doing and they take more care with it. But yeah, Food Forest have got about 15 different types of figs, so I definitely recommend them for that.
Sorry.
Yes, no, go for it.
It's a bit of a weird question. But this house that we're living in, but we demolished a house before, and the tenants that rented that house said that there was an amazing peach tree. So we rescued that peach tree. Last autumn, basically, my husband cut it down to almost nothing.
Yep, which is the right thing to do.
Okay, and then so in autumn we thought that's when trees start to go dormant. We stuck it in a wine barrel, and then in spring it started growing leaves and things. So it's still will it fruit? Because obviously this year it hasn't fruited, but do you recommend replanting trees that have been so we can bring it back into the garden?
If it's survived till now, then that's great. Often if it's pruned right back, the first season's growth won't produce much fruit, especially if it's been stressed. So some, like say an apple tree, you wouldn't get any fruit, definitely. Peaches and pear and nectarines, they can fruit off like new growth, but because you've cut it right back to the base stems, then I wouldn't have expected any fruit from it anyway, so that's okay. So now, yeah, I'd be planting it out in the winter and just, you know, the next line here was give them a great start to life. So dig a good hole, give it lots of compost, set it up nicely, and if you're really careful with it, I wouldn't prune it back too much this time. I'd give it a gentle prune, but not too much because it needs to kind of set its shape. But if it's survived till now, then it's got a pretty good chance. And the fact that it hasn't fruited the first year, I wouldn't worry too much about that. If it doesn't fruit in this next year, because hopefully the growth that it's done this year will then set the fruit next year. So,
Thank you.
no worries.
If I wanted to plant a mango tree into the ground, how would any footpath or cement area need to be?
Well, mangoes, they're pretty delicate here in Adelaide. They really don't like the winter. So, but people are successfully growing them. So you do have to make sure you get it in a spot which is as sheltered as possible, especially from the cold winds. Is it going to be near footpaths or what's the...
The front, I was going to put it in the front yard, and the front yard is about 6 metres deep.
Yep.
And then there's, you know, if it's in the middle, then 3 metres away would be the footpath.
That's fine.
And the house.
Does it get the winter winds, like the south westerlies or the southwesterlies, affect your front yard, or?
In front of the house, then it probably would be protected more.
Yep.
Yeah.
So if you're finding that it's struggling, I've had people put basically some big star pickets and then some shade cloth around it for the first year or two to kind of protect it from those cold winds. I've seen some really good productive mango trees. They just, but then if they're not in the right spot, they can struggle. So.
And cause damage? Would they?
No, they won't grow big, like not in Darwin.
What size have you seen?
The biggest I've seen is, probably only 6 metres high. Most of the ones I've seen really struggle to get that high. Like they just struggle through the winters, and whereas up in Darwin they're like 25 metres high and 30 metres high. In Timor and Indonesia they just, so, or even Brizzy. But yeah, Adelaide, no, they're a small fruit tree. So I wouldn't worry about the height and that. It's more actually just getting them to a point where they... But people have had good success, so... So yeah. So there is a group called the Rare Fruit Society where there's some mad keen mango growers in that who'd be willing to chew your ear off for as many hours as you've got to tell you the tips and hints of how to grow them successfully in Adelaide. So I'd kind of look them up and shoot an email and see what comes back. Natives. We've talked lots about natives already, but that's why I love it, and that's why I've got a slide here, because they're part of our system. So they help all of our productive plants to grow better, and it's part of creating that healthy ecosystem which manages our pests and our weeds, and which creates the environment that we can actually be participating in having a healthy ecosystem, even within the suburbs of Adelaide, and that's just so important that we all do our bit. How much time have we got?
1 minute.
1 minute. Plant more natives. Last slide. Didn't do too bad. Fruit tree pruning. So the question here is summer, autumn or winter? There's so many different ideas now, and people kind of not like, actually I do most of my pruning after the fruit drops if you can. So that means summer or autumn. Some of them like it more in winter, but generally winter is more for your big structural prunes. And once you get the shape right, then you can do smaller prunes each summer after the fruiting, and then you can have smaller, more compact fruit branches that will produce more in a smaller area. But there's a lot to it, and there's always more to learn no matter how much pruning you do. But do be, try and learn from experts as you can. Different plants have different shapes and ways of being managed. So we've got a recently pruned plum there. These ones will be pruned soon. But if you do prune, whenever you prune, try and do it when there's no rain that day and hopefully for the next couple of days, because that can create fungal problems in the future, especially for apricots. They really struggle with fungal problems. So whenever you do it, try and do that. And if you're doing it after fruiting in kind of summer or autumn, try not to do it when it's super hot as well, because they just don't like that either. But I won't go too much more into it because we're just about out of time.
All right, thank you, Lachlan. That was awesome.